business owners, leaders, entrepreneurs get everything they want from their business by implementing a complete, proven, simple system that helps them achieve three things that we call vision, traction, and healthy.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel Petitpas. I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. I'm extremely excited today to be joined by the leader of a business most of you listening to this have already heard of. In fact, most of you probably have already implemented EOS or you've been on the fence for some amount of time. Mark O'Donnell is here. He's the leader of EOS Worldwide, which of course is the Entrepreneurial Operating System popularized by Traction and these books by Gino Wickman over the years. And so he's here today to talk about EOS, of course, but specifically data and scorecards and how that plays into the whole EOS framework. So with all of that, Mark, thank you for making the time to join us on the show today.
And thanks for having me, Marcel. It's good to be here. And it's good that your audience loves EOS. And so we love to hear that. And hopefully they're making a big dent in their universe with the tools and the system and getting more of what they want from their business.
Well, this is, the impetus for us recording this podcast is I speak to a lot of agency owners every week, and I've just noticed this pattern. Every week, it's like half the people I'm talking to, they're either implementing EOS or they have recently implemented or they're thinking about implementing it. And so it seems like EOS is just kind of this tidal wave that's moving through our industry. And what it's been doing is creating this increased focus on the numbers and the scorecard because it's such an important piece of all of the accountability and the meeting rhythms. And so it got me thinking, hey, I know Mark, we connected a few years back while when you were initially working on the software platform, which we'll talk about. And so I reached out and you were gracious enough to come on. And I'm just excited for us to dig into this part of it because to your point, this is something a lot of people are turning to in order to get more out of their business, more out of their teams and create more of that alignment. And so far, I'm hearing nothing but good things. So you're doing something right.
Good to hear.
So for those that are not aware, maybe they've been living under a rock for a little while. Let's first start with, high level. What is EOS? And what should people know about it at a first principles level?
Yeah, sure. So EOS is the Entrepreneurial Operating System, and we help business owners, leaders, entrepreneurs get everything they want from their business by implementing a complete, proven, simple system that helps them achieve three things that we call vision, traction, and healthy. So vision is really just about getting you and your leadership team 100% on the same page with your vision, where you're going, how you're going to get there. Then traction's all about creating the disciplines and the habits necessary to execute on every aspect of that vision. And then finally, healthy is creating really healthy, cohesive, and functional leadership teams. We start with the leadership team, then we work down throughout the organization, getting everyone rowing in the same direction. They're seeing the same thing. They're wanting the same thing. They're becoming masters of execution, all the while being, fun-loving, happy team. And so that's what we do all day, every day. We've worked with over 26,000 companies to date with an EOS implementer, who are the coaches who help entrepreneurs do this. But then we have over 300,000 companies have downloaded our tools, whether it's, VTOs or Vision Traction Organizer or other tools to make an impact in their business. And we've sold over 3 million books to date. So knock on wood, something's working. And we have some pretty good ideas why that is, but we'll get into it.
Yeah. And so I think that's a great kind of primer on, what is EOS? We're going to assume for the rest of the episode that most people know what it is. But if you don't, there'll be all kinds of stuff in the show notes for you to go and dive into this world. And it's very possible that if you weren't aware of EOS, you probably interacted with some framework that comes from EOS in the books, whether it's the one-page strategic plan, whether it's quarterly rocks, whether it's the vision traction organizer, whether it's some of these meeting cadences or meeting agendas that you guys have popularized. So I just love how it's not only a framework for how to think about running in an organization, but also all of the tools to support the execution and implementation of that. And then that leads us to your background. So how do you become the CEO of a company like EOS Worldwide? And I know your background is, of course, running businesses yourself, but then also in coaching. So let's, if we could just briefly talk about how Mark O'Donnell became the CEO of this company.
Well, it's a long journey filled with a lot of luck. And it's just an honor and a privilege to serve entrepreneurs in this capacity. I got my start as an engineer in pharma and biotech. Started my first company with my brother, caught the entrepreneurial bug. We ended up with 9 companies in this vertically integrated pharma biotech services business, succeeding in spite of ourselves. We had some success with that. We were growing really fast. We had 2 companies, at 1.3 companies on the Inc. 500, 5,000 list. And it was just complete and utter mayhem and chaos the entire time we were growing these things. And we just loved it and we kept going. I was introduced to EOS in a really odd place, which was at the Pentagon of all places. And having lunch with a 3-star general, took a deep dive into EOS and traction, started implementing it in my business, fell in love with the results I was getting. Joined the EOS implementer community, not to be an EOS implementer, but really just to use the tools in a deeper level and get my understanding a little bit deeper. Fell in love with the community of entrepreneurs, decided to exit the day-to-day of my companies, ultimately sold them all in 2018, and started working with other entrepreneurial businesses as an EOS implementer. Then I started coaching other EOS implementers, eventually head coach, running the coaching team, still working with clients. And in 2020, I really just found that in order for me to get really the leverage that I want, I have a personal mission to help 1 million people live a life they love. And I knew that I was making an impact as an implementer, but in order to hit that 1 million, I was going to need some leverage. Archimedes, give me a long enough lever and I can move the world. So for me, EOS was that lever, and it just the stars aligned, and EOS happened to be looking for the next generation visionary to take over for Mike Payton, who took over for Gino Wickman. And so it seemed to be a fit. And I was recruited by Kelly Knight, who is our integrator or COO or president, however words you want to use for that. And she became my business partner, and we've grown about 400% since. So that it's been a ride.
It's an incredible backstory, and especially that you came up through not only building your own company, but then becoming an EOS implementer, which is such a huge part of this ecosystem, really, that has been birthed out of the EOS framework. Is this army of people that what they do is help other businesses really adopt and implement this whole framework. So very cool that was the entry point to you then becoming a part of the company. So with all of that, I want to crop into the topic du jour, which is really the data side of this framework, which is something you've been thinking very deeply about for some time now, as you've been writing the manuscript for a book that will be coming out a little over a year from when we're recording this podcast, which is really focused on the data side of things. So there are 6 elements to EOS. Yep. We have the vision, we have the people, we have the data, we have the issues, we have the process, and traction. Those are kind of some of the core concepts, at least that I drew from the book. Why is data and the scorecard such an important component to making this whole system work?
Yeah. And you mentioned first principles earlier. And one thing to know too is that those 6 key components that we call them, Gino went into his workshop 25 years ago, and he wanted to create something that was timeless. These tools existed way before EOS, and they'll exist thousands of years into the future. But he just said, okay, what are the tools that if I pull the lever, it makes a client smile, it gets what they want from their business? And so he tested over 1,200 total tools, tweaking and honing and refining and creating his own, and really brought it down to just the core essence of what it takes to run a great entrepreneurial business with the least amount of time, effort, and energy with the most results. So leveraging that 20-80 rule. And so all the tools that we have, we don't add new tools to the toolbox because these are first principles tools, and there's really not much. We would take away some if we could, but we haven't figured out how and which ones we would do that. So they're first principle based stuff. And so when you think about the scorecard, it's really a way to measure what it is that you want from your business and to plot the course along the way. And so it's really about first deciding what it is that you want from your business, whether it's revenue or profit or whatever it might be. And then you take the activity base. So we use a tool called the Getting What You Want tool. You just begin with the end in mind, just like Stephen Covey taught us. And then you take one step back, one step back, one step back on activity-based things. So that scorecard is so important because every week you come together with your leadership team or with your departmental team, and you're saying, what activities did we do that lead to what it is that we want from the business? Not lagging indicators, but activity-based stuff. And we drive accountability as a result of that. We can track trends, and ultimately we can grow the business. As the saying goes, what gets measured gets done. But we kind of take that one step further and say what gets measured and reported goes exponential. And so every single person in your company has a number that is showing up that they're accountable for on a scorecard. They're delivering that number to the business each week, and that's directly tied to your vision of what it is that you want. So anytime that your scorecard numbers are going off track a little bit, you can kind of kiss your 10-year target or core target or big, hairy, audacious goal, whatever you want to call it, goodbye, because it's really the future view of your P&L ultimately.
Mm. And this is a theme, the idea of making things measurable and objective. It's a theme that we see throughout many of the elements that are presented in EOS. For example, we talk about rocks, which is something, we've been doing as a company for a long time. Making it objective and measurable is a really key component of making sure that those are effective. What is it about the objectivity that leads to better alignment, leads to better collaboration, that leads to more effectiveness essentially in the rest of these components, in particular the meetings, the accountability? Why is that such an important component?
Well, what I would start with the vision and just say, okay, what it is that we want as entrepreneurs, get that documented. We do that by answering 8 questions. You get it shared by everyone. The step one, now we do traction first, vision second, but just for the purposes of the illustration is that you're clear on where you want to go as a business. You've got the right people in the right seats. They share your core values. You love them. They get, want, and have the capacity to do their roles that they've been assigned. That next brings in the setup for data, because now you know where you're going. You got the right people on the bus, right? You know where you're going. How are we going to measure the accountability? We want, and it does lean back into strengthening the accountability that comes around right people, right seats. Sometimes the seats get too big. Sometimes the seats get too small for the person's capability. And so that data component really gives a pulse on the business. Are you on track? Are your people accountable? Are we winning? So many times, you without that scorecard, and we've worked with people who will implement all the 6 key components except for the data component, or sometimes the process component too. But the data, they'll just say, we can't really measure this. Well, they're sort of kidding themselves because there's no accountability, there's no winning. And when you have that, humans are going to do what humans do. And there's places to hide in that company. And the efficiency and the productivity and ultimately the profit just won't be there because you're not holding people into account. Now, one thing I will say as well is that when you are measuring, you're going to attract people to your company who love being measured. And you're going to kind of push away those who don't like to be measured. Well, there's a key difference between people who love to be measured and the ones that don't love to be measured. And that is performance. People, I mean, nobody really loves to be measured, but people love to win. So it's like the balance of, I don't really want to be measured, but I really want to win. So measure me so I can get better. And so it creates a culture inside the business that propels you forward. There's no place to hide. The other thing that it does is it smokes out all the issues, all the impurities inside the company, and they start to rise to the top. I use the analogy of the way gold is refined, right? It gets put under pressure and put under fire, and all the chaff, all the impurities rise to the top, and you take it off. That's what the scorecard is doing. That's what the data component is doing. It's putting that pressure under the under the pot. The impurities are rising to the top. We call those issues. And if you're putting them on an issues list, you're solving them at the root, they go away forever, and your data improves, your activities improve, and your ability to achieve what it is that you want from your business goes up.
There's a couple of things here that really resonate with me personally. Just in my experience of knowing what it feels like to go too far down a path and realizing we don't have any measurement of this. There's nothing that's objective here. And the issues that come out of that, the subjectivity of what is good and what is bad, turning discussions that should be collaborative about how do we move forward and get to where we want to go, turning into competitive arguments about whether something is happening or not, or whether something is good enough or not, or whether something is on track or not. And of course, to your point, human nature, and that we're going to justify away and try to rationalize whatever the situation is, unless we have that very clear objective measurement of is it or is it not what we said it was going to be, as well as the pressure to really define in a very clear way what the vision is, what the outcome is. And that's a really easy trap to fall into is writing a vision or establishing an objective and having it be a little too ephemeral, and then it's open to interpretation, and then it doesn't actually create the clarity or alignment that the whole team needs to work together. And there's something really healthy about that, and I think that makes a lot of sense in that there's so many meetings and exercises that happen throughout the kind of annual cadence that EOS runs on, that without that anchor of we've all agreed to and committed to these things that are very objective, then those meetings might not be nearly as productive, because rather than sitting on the same side of the table as a team and saying we are or we aren't achieving this, why and what do we do about it, we might get into this argument of, well, we think this is good enough and these other people don't, or we think we're on track and these other people don't, or we think this is happening and these other people think this other thing is happening. And that is a dangerous trap to fall into. And if you've ever been in it, you know what it feels like. It's not very good.
Right. And it's interesting too, because when you think about, I'll quote Jim Barksdale, the former CEO of Netscape, right? He said, if we have the data, let's go with the data. If all we have are opinions, let's go with mine. So when you don't have that data, you're just dealing with subjectives and egos and opinions, and it really lacks empiricism to say this is what's really happening. And then we're tearing everything apart. We can rebuild back again from first principles, saying this is the best way to chart our path forward to get what we want. And you mentioned the level 10 meetings. With the level 10 meeting, you're reviewing your scorecard, and any item that is off track, you're dropping it down to your issues list. You're solving it at the root so it goes away forever. And this most often goes back to that people component, because we see about 80 to 85% of the time, there's someone's face at the bottom of that off-track scorecard item. Someone didn't follow the process. Someone didn't show up to work that day. Someone's not capable of doing it. Or maybe we set the goal that was a little bit outrageous. But if you don't have that data, if you don't have those metrics to measure that performance, it's just going to get glossed over. The other thing, too, with that weekly level 10 meeting, a lot of people want to do it once a month, every other week, or something like that, but they're robbing themselves of tight feedback loops. If you don't have your weekly cadence, your weekly pulse, if you miss one or two, I mean, imagine if you do it once a month and you come together, you look at your scorecard, half the stuff is off track. Well, you got another month before you can see any level of feedback on that. And if you miss one, you got 2 months before you can even do anything about it. You might be dead in the water before you even realize it. So having that weekly cadence, weekly pulse is super important with that data component in the scorecard.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it. So this leads us into, I think, the meat of our conversation today, which is it's easy to say you got to have a scorecard. It's easy to say you got to, set the objectives and then measure them weekly. But doing that in practice can be actually quite difficult, quite elusive for a lot of different reasons. So this is something you've been thinking a lot about and writing about. What are some of the biggest challenges that people face when it comes time for them to start implementing a scorecard in this system, and they really get into the nuances of it?
So again, as I said before, everything really starts with what it is that you want. And then you work your way backwards, the milestones, the major steps in order to get there, and you decide which ones you're going to measure or not. And that would stem from multiple processes inside your company. So if you have your sales and marketing process, let's start with a marketing process. Let's just focus in on that one. Inside of a company, not as from an agency perspective, but and kind of from an agency, it's just a different operations seat, right? Is your job is to produce warm leads that you can hand to sales for sales to close them. That is what you want. You want X number of warm leads per week. Well, if we work our way back to what precedes a warm lead, maybe it's a form fill. Well, how do I get a form fill? Well, I got to get people on the squeeze page. Okay. Well, how do I get people on the squeeze page? I got to have visits to my website, or I got to have visits to my social page or my ads or whatever it might be. And you work your way back, and then that is the activity. You've just outlined your entire marketing scorecard. And there's lots of different ways you can do that, but you just, whatever the steps in the process are, how are we measuring that? And when people struggle with, and then someone's accountable for each one of those steps, people struggle with not being able to begin with the end in mind and work their way back. And to me, that goes to a people issue most of the time, where do you really know what you're doing if you can't describe the process to generate a warm lead and you're sitting in a marketing seat? So I would start right there and say, if you cannot grab the bull by the horns and describe to me the process and how to measure it, I question whether or not you know what you're doing. Then we take that. So the first piece of a sales process is a warm lead, but what I really want is a closed deal for X dollars, right? And so you can work your way back. I need proposals. I need to have lunch with people maybe. I need to create the bid. You work your way back there, and I have to therefore have 25 warm leads that gets me to my one sale, and I'm measuring all along that line. And you're picking and choosing along that way.
One of the things that I've found to be a common thread in a lot of the conversations that I have around this component of agency businesses in particular is people have a tendency to start building their scorecard by first looking at what everybody else is measuring.
Yes, that's the worst thing you could possibly do.
Right. They get on Google and they're like, top 50 metrics for an agency to track. And then they start kind of cobbling together a set of metrics. Worse yet, cobbling together different ways of calculating those metrics. And what I find is you end up with often a bloated scorecard with a bunch of metrics that nobody actually knows the meaning of. Mm-hmm. They're not even necessarily aligned and clear on how it's being measured and why it's being measured that way, or how it's being calculated and why it's being calculated that way. And ultimately what it leads to is a massive devaluation of the scorecard. If you imagine having the meeting where you gloss over these metrics, no action or real insight or decisions come from that. There's no real accountability or clarity around those metrics. And 3 or 4 of those meetings go by, and now all of a sudden everyone has learned that the scorecard is kind of meaningless. It doesn't really lead to anything. It's kind of a waste of time. And that's a dangerous thing and a tough thing to recover from. And so your idea of saying we got to start with the end in mind and work backwards, I think is an important one. And I would couple that with the idea that we should know what each metric is doing in terms of what question it answers or what decision it helps inform, in terms of if it's on track or off track, or if it's above or below target. What does that actually mean for the business? What decision would that help us make, or what question would it help us answer in that meeting? And if those things aren't clear, then there's more work that needs to be done before that thing makes its way onto the scorecard.
That's exactly right. And we're really looking for the 5 to 15 numbers, that preferably 5, that if you were disconnected, you just glance at those 5 numbers and you're like, we're good, or we're not good. And I know exactly where to look, who to look for, what process is not working. It needs to be really quick, really efficient. And if you add 25 things, 50 things, the chances of you going through that and being able to understand where your business is at a glance are near zero. And a good example of that, we had a little bit of an internal training from a former Blue Angels boss. So he flew the F-18s, I guess it is, really fast Navy airplanes. I don't remember which one. But he's like, hey, when I first became a pilot, we had, over time, the technology got better and we could measure more things. And so inside the cockpit of these jets, there was like 25 to 30 different gauges. But when they were in combat, and not the Blue Angels, but when these pilots were in combat, they would only ever rely on just a handful of gauges. So over time, they actually ended up removing all of the technology, all of the gauges. I mean, they're obviously highly sophisticated, but they skinnied it down to just 5 or so, just a handful of gauges to actually be able to fly the plane under pressure, because they didn't need all that superfluous data. It was confusing. It was complex. And when you're in the heat of battle, you're looking at the wrong thing because you're under pressure. Not that those folks get rattled very much, but that's the same concept here. Is you got to have 5 to 15 at the most, so you can understand where you are at a glance. Really simple, and you've done the thinking to get there. Because if you go to ChatGPT and say, hey, what's a company like mine measure, you're going to get a response, and they might do some good thinking for you. It might take you down an interesting path, but it's just really not going to provide any value, because you're missing all the rigor that is required to measure the right things for your business, because you're unique.
Now, this leads to what you just touched on here. I think the idea of like less is more when it comes to data, and really focusing on those key metrics. It reminds me of another thing that I see a lot, which is people trying to infer reasoning from their business scorecard. So trying to track things at such a level of detail that essentially they can look at a spreadsheet and make a determination about why something has happened. And we have the saying internally that the data can only tell you what the data is. It can never tell you why the data is. Only people can do that part. Mm-hmm. And I think, I don't want to project this onto you, but my sense is that's a big part of the reason why this stuff gets reviewed in meetings with people, and why, you encourage this simpler version of the scorecard. So talk a little bit about what the conversation needs to look like around the scorecard, and how those two things come together to drive better outcomes.
So when you're in that level 10 meeting, you're going through your reporting. So the first 5 minutes of that level 10 meeting, 15 minutes or so, total reviewing, but you're taking 5 minutes to review the scorecard. You're just saying on track, off track. Anything off track or something you want to know more about, you're just dropping down to your issues list. So let's say you go through, you get to IDS, identify, discuss, and solve, and you've got an off track. Well, it's going to start with who's accountable, who's the who on your team, who owns this number. And they really should be the primary drivers of that conversation. If they're not, you got an accountability issue, something's not working the way it should. And so let's just assume that person, as I said before, grabs the bull by the horns, like, hey, this is exactly what's going on. Maybe we had an outage in Google Tag Manager and it didn't work, and we got no trackable leads. They're there, they showed up. We just don't know who they are, where they came from. And so there was a data issue. Okay, fine. We fixed it. We take a to-do or two to get that back on track. And so we should be very precise, and also know that you have a leadership team scorecard, but that is fed by, in an ideal world, by all the departmental scorecards, where that department or team is accountable for delivering something that then flows up into that one number on the leadership team scorecard, so forth and so on. So by the time you get to your level 10 meeting with your leadership team, that leader should know precisely what went wrong and why you're seeing what you're seeing. On an activity, that's why the activity-based numbers are much, much more effective than lagging indicators or non-activity-based numbers. And so the other thing to think about too, when you're, I'm a big fan of sort of the black swan empirical level of thinking. You can't dismiss the level of luck that is occurring and that we're going to get numbers and they might mean something or they might not. And so you just got to be really disciplined around digging to the root cause of the thing. And there's things that you can control and there's things that you can't control. And sometimes the trick is to know the difference between the two. And so that it can just be, hey, it was, bad luck. We can't really control that, but you can usually control your activities. And so you want to lean towards activity based. It's a flow up. So when you walk in that meeting, the person who owns it has an answer. You shouldn't be surprised when your number is off track walking into that meeting.
Yeah. There's a couple of first principles that I think this innately speaks to, but are worth explicitly calling out. And the first one is, this idea of measuring metrics weekly. Yep. And there's a lot of metrics that people want to track weekly, but might not be feasible to track weekly. Like a lot of financial metrics, for example, even if you threw a ton of resources at your finance department, like there's a lot of things that just might not be able to be done on a weekly basis. If you're waiting a month for invoices to come in from external vendors, like there's things that might be outside of your control, but these activity-based metrics are the ones that you often have a lot more agency over how frequently those can be measured. So that lends itself really well to these tighter feedback loops. The other thing that I like a lot about that is that often, to your point, you can't control outcomes. So much of what's being measured here is we had a set of assumptions about the activities that were going to lead to the outcomes that we wanted to. And what this is really doing is validating or invalidating that thesis on a tight feedback loop. Like, hey, we've done several weeks, we're doing all the activities that we assumed would lead to this outcome, but what we're discovering is that correlation is not there, or it's not as strong as we thought. And so then the conversation is, well, what is a new thesis that we can test in terms of the activities that lead to the outcomes? And then the last thing that you touched on is nuance, but I think it's really important, is that we're arriving at these conclusions, but there is continuity in terms of the questions that we're answering at the highest levels of the business and how things are being measured at the ground level. And of all of the things that I see really get in the way of firms, especially marketing firms and agencies, getting their ops data straightened out, it's that disconnect where you have a project management team, for example, or a delivery team that is tracking so many things at such a precise level. And then when the time comes to roll that up to a higher level conversation, like, I don't know, how profitable are our websites compared to our SEO projects? We have extremely precise data that's not structured in a way that it can answer those questions. And so you end up with these massive disconnects between what people are tracking and paying attention to at the ground level and what we're trying to do at the executive level. That can often cause delays. It often causes a lack of clarity. We can't answer what's going on when we get into that meeting. And that's like it should be an obvious thing, but it's missed more often than not. Mm-hmm. And I think it speaks to, again, this nuanced but very important thing, which is starting with that top level scorecard, the objectives, the vision, and working back, as opposed to building everything starting with like the constraint of, well, what's the raw data that is getting spit out of our project management tool, for example, and what can we get out of that? That is kind of like going to the hardware store and buying a bunch of materials and then saying, okay, well, what can we build with all of this stuff? It's really kind of backwards.
You can build something.
So, Mark, you've been doing a lot of thinking around this. I'm really excited that, the list of books that have been published around EOS, you've covered most of the aspects in depth. This was one of the few aspects that didn't have a full book dedicated to it. Now that you've spent so much time on this, are there any final ideas that you think are worth sharing with the audience before, of course, we point them to some other resources in the show notes?
Yeah. So I think the final thing, and you hit it with where I started, which is getting what you want from your business. What is it that you want? Could be a profit number, whatever it is. And then EOS is designed for this complete and holistic system. Well, what does that look like? It's not just the scorecard. When we think about scorecard and measurables, where everyone in your company has a number they're accountable for, and you also have to think about, if I can't measure, because some people say, well, I can't measure what they do. If you can't measure what a person's output or results are, you have to ask yourself why they're here. If you can't do it, you should really consider finding a new role or freeing up the cash flow. And so scorecard, measurables, everybody's got a number. Also, when you think about the accountability chart, the roles and responsibilities for each person inside your company, we've got 5 bullet points that describe what that person's delivering to the business. They're right people, right seats, right? You can measure the output of each of those roles, and that gives you the start of what's going to go on the scorecard. In addition to that, you have the process component with documenting your handful of core processes, your major steps. Well, what are the outputs of each major step in that process, and how do we measure the success of that step? Who owns it? It's the same person who owns it on the accountability chart. It's the same person who has that as their number. It's the same person who's reporting on the scorecard in their level 10 meeting. So all these tools are holistically working together to get you what you want from your business. And so whether you mentioned, like, is SEO project better or website project better? Well, that is all an offshoot of the profit that you want, the vision that you've set for yourself. And there's underlying processes that are driving that by people. And we can measure each step in the process as long as we're following it. And it brings together this entire world where you can know exactly where you are at all times, what activities you need to be doing. There's nuances you mentioned. Some stuff we do might not work. Well, we're experimenting here. The conversions rates are a little off. The world changed a little bit, and that doesn't work anymore. But it's all giving you that total tight pulse, tight feedback loop. Who's doing what? And you'll get it. You'll get it if you continue with the activities. It has a compound interest to it. So that would be the last thing, just to think about it from a holistic point of view.
And I think that's a perfect segue into kind of where folks should go next, because the framework has all 6 of these major elements. There's a ton of tools and resources. Many of them are free and available to people, at little to no cost, the cost of buying a book or downloading a free resource. So for those that want to dive deeper into EOS that maybe haven't had the opportunity to do that yet, where should we send them in the show notes to learn more about it?
Yeah, you can go to www.eosworldwide.com. There's loads and loads of resources there. We have tons of free videos on YouTube, and you can reach out to me on LinkedIn. If you follow me on LinkedIn, I'm usually posting something there that is of use. Otherwise, you can just send me a message. That works too. And we also have our software, which is EOS One. You can get there from the EOS Worldwide website. We give a free user for free forever to everyone who signs up. You got the 5 foundational tools. And the reason we do that, by the way, is we just believe that if you help enough people get what they want, you'll get what you want. And we want to give as much value as we can before expecting anything in return. And so you can implement EOS with basically little to no money. There's 3 ways to do that. Again, all the free resources, tools, you can read the book and self-implement. You can join our Basecamp product, which is teaching facilitators and coaches for your own company. So if there's someone who's really into facilitating leadership team meetings and wants to learn how to do that, we can do that. And then, of course, you can hire an EOS implementer to help directly. And there's 850 of them in 37 countries. So you'd be hard pressed to not be able to find one. And the directory is on our website there too.
And yeah, there are some great ones out there. And I know a few that specialize in agency. So if you want a recommendation, I'm happy to do an intro. Just reach out to me about that. We'll have all of that in the show notes, including links to the free resources, the books, the software, which I recommend you go check out. That's a fairly new thing, but it's super exciting and looks like just an awesome tool for people that are running this system in their business. So with all of that, Mark, I can't thank you enough for making the time to be here. I really enjoyed our conversation. And
thanks for having me.
Yeah. Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.